everyone. Welcome to Understanding the Business Environment. And today, joining us is Mr. Benjamin William, who is the CEO of Red Cross Singapore. So, thank you for being here, Ben. We're very happy to have you today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be able to join you today as well.
Yeah. So, I think we're all familiar with what Red Cross does. So it is dedicated to relieving human suffering. So how about we start today by discussing the significant role that Red Cross Singapore has played in the context of reducing poverty and inequality. So Singapore is often seen as a prosperous nation, but these poverty and inequality issues still persist. So can you tell us a bit more about the poverty and inequality issue in Singapore and how Red Cross Singapore's initiatives contribute to reduce the poverty and inequality within the country?
Okay, so the first thing that anyone hears about Singapore or comes to the mind of Singapore is the fact that Singapore is a rich nation, that we are a nation that have grown from third world to first world in a very short time, that we are a very affluent society. Anyone visiting Singapore will not be able to notice abject poverty in Singapore, not even in a manner that you can observe it in, say, in the US and other places. So abject poverty may not be so obvious in Singapore. So in Singapore, when you talk about poverty, you often refer to hidden poverty. One of the great successes of the Singapore government in terms of providing for the needs of the country is our housing policy. And our public housing encompasses all strata of society. So in a particular housing estate, you will find people living in the 5-room flats, which are the upper middle income people, as well as those living in the 1-room and rental flats. These are the lower income people. But they are all in the same estate. And when you look at it from outside, you will not be able to see poverty. Until you open the door and you visit the households, then you will be able to recognize poverty in Singapore. So poverty in Singapore, my first point is that poverty in Singapore is not as obvious as poverty in most other countries, including affluent countries, first world countries. So often for organizations like Singapore Red Cross, when we are working with in the area of reducing vulnerability and helping disadvantaged families, a lot of work has to go into identifying who are the people who need help.
Right.
So that's the first point to bear in mind. The second point to bear in mind in Singapore is that Singapore actually doesn't have an official poverty line. You see, many countries have declared a poverty line, but Singapore, we have not. So when you look at statistics, it's not that easy to identify poverty. The third thing is that we have to recognize and we have to study where the incidence of poverty lies. So each organization, each charity organizations and social sector organization decides to work in a certain area. In the case of Singapore Red Cross, we have primarily focused on those who are disabled, those who are elderly, and those who come from disadvantaged family backgrounds. So some of the programs that we run in Singapore, the humanitarian services that we provide, are targeted at these groups. One of the biggest area of concern in Singapore is the growing number of elderly persons. In Singapore, we expect that by 2030, 1 in 4 persons will be above the age of 65. It will bring us into the category of one of the oldest country in the world. But that is just one statistic. The other statistic, which not always mentioned together with this, is that, for example, Singapore Red Cross estimates that about 100,000 of these people will be living alone.
Mm-hmm.
And these 100,000, many of them are from lower income families.
Okay.
So a lot of our programs that Singapore Red Cross does is targeted at this group of people. And we hope by working with them, these elderly persons will continue to be able to live in their own house and not have a need to move to a nursing home, and yet have someone take care of them when their family members are not around. So I can elaborate on the programs, but in a nutshell, that's one big area. The second big area is disabled. We work a lot with the most disabled, those who are both physically and mentally disabled. And here we essentially run a home for this category of people, most of whom are from lower income groups, and most of them are highly subsidized by Singapore Red Cross. So we hope to give them a quality of life despite their disabilities in a very expensive and affluent environment. The final group is disadvantaged families, but we don't deal with a big group of disadvantaged families. What we are trying to do is work with young people in disadvantaged families who otherwise may not contribute to breaking the poverty cycle. Okay. So we have a program which tries to mentor and tutor these young people so that as they grow up, they can help to break the poverty cycle instead of continuing the poverty cycle.
Mm-hmm. So like provide them the tremendous education opportunities, make sure that they would like to go to the higher education, something like that.
Okay, so okay, that is a higher goal. Huh? So most education in Singapore is fairly universal, and the government provides the education. But if you're coming from a household where you don't have mentor figures, often the parents are missing, they're taken care of by grandparents, parents may be in prison, or may have abandoned the family. If you don't have a means whereby you mentor these children, help in the reading program, help to keep them focused on their study, there's a good chance that they will slip away and continue the poverty cycle. Okay. So our goal is to intervene early enough to keep them motivated, to keep them in the schooling system, make them successful in the schooling system, so that they get a chance to succeed and do well.
Okay, that's fabulous. So I think you mentioned three important areas that Red Cross are focusing on on reducing the poverty and inequality. And I think you mentioned that a key, important thing that you are trying to fight with is to actually identify who are the real targets, that who are the people who really need your help to get rid of the poverty or inequality. And you mentioned that they could be like elderly persons, they are elderly populations. So I'm wondering, usually these populations, they may not that be good at technology, right? So I mean, if you're working with like young people who are from disadvantaged group, if you teach them technology, it's easy for you to track them, how they have developed with your program. But for these people, like the elderly people, the elderly population, they're not good at using those new technologies. So I think my next question is about how Red Cross kind of make its effort to kind of address these unique challenges that these specific targeted population who are facing the poverty and inequality. How do you actually identify them? Do you actually go to each household and lock the door and find are they the people who need your help? How do you actually identify them and also track how the program is going?
Okay. You have a number of questions there. So first is identifying the people that eventually become our beneficiaries. So there are a number of ways of identifying our beneficiaries. In fact, one of the big challenges in Singapore is how we can coordinate within the social sector, because there are people who are over provided for. There are several charities helping them, and then there are those that are none. So the first thing that we do is that we work closely with the other players in the charity sector to see. So a certain charity may be providing this service, and some of their beneficiaries may need our home monitoring service that Singapore Red Cross provides. So working with them, they may be their primary beneficiaries, but we are providing the home monitoring service for these beneficiaries, and we work with other social service sector people. Secondly, we work with the government structures that have been set up. One of the primary government sectors that has been set out is what you call the family service centers. So the family service centers often will refer the people who need assistance depending on what the charity is doing. And in the case of elderly, whether it's a befriending service or the home monitoring service, we get referrals from them. The third area is because we are involved in multiple services, sometimes when we are doing a particular service, we realize that this person also needs another service. So let me give you an example. One of the services that targets the elderly in Singapore is called the medical chaperone. So we have many elderly persons who come from the lower income group that don't even have someone who will be able to take them to their medical appointments. So medical service may be free for them, but they don't even have someone taking them. So we provide medical chaperone whereby our volunteers will actually accompany this person to the hospital or clinic, stay with them, and then bring them back. As we deal in this survey, sometimes we get feedback from our volunteers that this person is living alone, has not much support, may be a useful candidate for our home monitoring. Our home monitoring is a 24-hour monitoring, and our volunteers actually respond 24 hours. So then this person becomes a beneficiary of our home monitoring. So there's also the cross referrals within our services. And finally, we have just referrals from the public. Now, whenever we get a referral, we don't just automatically take them on as our beneficiaries. We have our social worker network as well as our own staff to visit them, to assess and see whether they need support. And if they need support, do they get 100% subsidy or 50% subsidy? And this is how we identify the beneficiaries.
Okay.
The second question you asked is, I think, how do we know what are their needs, right? And how do we continue to monitor? So in most of our services to the elderly, we actually are linking them up with our volunteers. So our services in Singapore Red Cross are not hit and miss. So these volunteers stay with the families that we have assigned them to for a long period of time. They actually understand their needs and they continue to monitor and give us feedback. And in most of our programs, we have constant assessment every 6 months or so to see whether they made progress, whether they still deserve our help, or they can move on. Because sometimes it is temporary help that they need, and then they can move on. So these are some of the things that we do. Was there another aspect of your question that I missed?
No, I think that's very, very informative already. So I think based on your description on how Red Cross works and what you have delivered in all those programs, the key, I believe the key role is the volunteers that you have assigned to your beneficiaries. So this so this is linked to probably my next question is that I understand that Red Cross also plays a pivotal role during the emergencies and crises. And as we all know, there is a pressing contemporary crisis, which is COVID-19. And this pandemic has undoubtedly had far-reaching effects on societies worldwide. So during those COVID-19, I'm not sure what happened in Singapore, but potentially they also have some period that people need to be isolated, that you will have lockdown period. And during those crises, during those emergencies, could you elaborate on how Red Cross Singapore has quickly adapted its efforts to address these unique challenges that COVID-19 has brought to the forefront, particularly in relation to the poverty and inequality.
Okay, so I think COVID-19 was a wake-up call for a lot of people. And it was unique in the sense that almost the whole world was affected.
Yeah.
So Singapore Red Cross had two broad roles, one domestic and one international. Earlier I mentioned that, Singapore Red Cross services essentially I was talking about Singapore-based, but we also have an international work that we do. So in terms of COVID-19 response, our work was both local and international. In the local landscape, there were two parts to it. One was continuing the work that we were doing regularly. So in Singapore, we were fortunate that the government authorities was able to handle the broader response to COVID-19. So the social service sector did not have to get involved in things like the vaccination and the overall education programs, the alert levels and all that. In some countries, many of the charities had to get involved in the vaccination program and all that. In our case, we didn't. So our role became taking care of the people in terms of their day-to-day needs, right? So the first challenge that Singapore Red Cross faced in terms of working with our beneficiaries, and most of them are from lower income or middle income, was to keep our services going. And as you correctly point out in my last intervention, that a lot of our work depended on volunteers. So first of all, the needs of our beneficiaries increased. Suddenly those who are isolated and living alone were even further isolated. They couldn't even go out and, they had challenges. Then how do you bring your volunteers? Many of our volunteers were also concerned about their health, about going out. And, there were a lot of restrictions on visitation and all that. So we had to work the system, get the approvals for our volunteers to visit. So fortunately, we had built up a good pool of dedicated volunteers who continued to help, right? So that was one challenge. The second challenge was the needs of our beneficiaries increased. So for example, we have a befriending service where we visit the elderly twice a month and call them twice a month, 4 touch points. During COVID, we had to increase. And sometimes our volunteer had to actually also do the shopping for them, for the groceries and all that, because being elderly, it made it much more risky for them to go out. Right? So we had to. And then the third challenge that we faced was being able to raise sufficient funds, because a lot of our donors and all that were also facing challenges in terms of income. So we had to reach out to new donors, organizations and all that to raise sufficient resources to take care of our normal beneficiary, keep our beneficiary program going. The second element of our local response was that suddenly our beneficiary base increased. So for example, in one of our programs, our beneficiary base almost doubled because people were losing their jobs. And now it's slightly different because while the initial beneficiary base is a bit more permanent, long term, some of them needed help for 6 months, 3 months until they managed to get a job or managed to get back on their feet. So we had to also modify our program to provide this short-term assistance. That's number one. So expanding our normal services to a bigger group of people. And then we suddenly had to also respond to the needs of a different group of people. And if you know COVID-19 in Singapore, one of the worst hits group of people, communities, was the migrant worker community. Besides the fact that many of them had their income curtailed because they couldn't work, many of them were also locked down in their dorms. So they had both a physical need as well as a psychological need. So in terms of the physical need, yes, they were being given the basic necessities, but after a while you cannot just eat
the same food over and over days.
And many of them are from different of cultures. So Singapore Red Cross stepped in to help with packages for the migrant workers, not only in terms of food, but also in terms of hygiene and all that.
Okay.
And then I think COVID-19, both for the local community and the migrant community, emphasized the psychological stress that was just below the surface of what appeared to be a very peaceful and affluent society. Right? So the mental well-being and the psychological support suddenly surfaced. And in fact, Singapore Red Cross stepped in to fill the gap. And from that, our psychological support program has grown exponentially. So today, Singapore Red Cross is one of the main providers of psychological first aid training.
Okay. Oh, that's
the
good.
Yeah, the premise being the more people who are trained in psychological first aid, the simple issues can be taken care of by the public, and not having everyone go to psychiatric or counseling help. So these are some of the things that we did. Internationally, you may not be very interested, but Singapore Red Cross actually ended up helping about 38 countries, mainly with supplies, PPEs, equipment for responding to COVID-19.
Okay. So things you mentioned about international, actually, that is perfectly related to my next question, because yes, we all know that we're living in this globalization age, and Singapore plays a critical role in not only in Asia but also like internationally. So could you elaborate on how does Red Cross Singapore view the role of the nation itself in addressing like the poverty and inequality issues around the world, and how does Red Cross collaborate with various stakeholders to create a more equitable societies?
So, so creating an equitable society globally is a very noble goal. So I think we'll be hard pressed to say that that is our goal, but what is our goal is the sub goal of that goal. So for Singapore Red Cross, a fairly small national society. Yes, we are affluent society, but we are a small national society. We try to do what we can to address the needs, especially of those who are from vulnerable communities around the world. Much of our program in the past focused on disaster response. So when a disaster hits almost anywhere in the world, the worst hit are the lowest income group. Those already in poverty, those already challenged. It's almost universal that they are the worst hit. And Singapore Red Cross over the last 10, 20 years have been actually responding to these communities to help take care of their needs, both in the immediate disaster aftermath, as well as in the rebuilding and the rebuilding of lives area. Then over time, we focus a bit more on livelihood. So we realized that yes, you build a house, you provide the house, but how about the living? How they can continue? So we have supported livelihood projects. One example I give is a recent example is Sri Lanka. When Sri Lanka faced its financial crisis, it was very strange. As we worked with our partners, we also realized that in a sense, it was not even the poor that was the worst hit. The poor, as in those living in the rural communities, they still had their farms, they still had their chicken running around in the garden and things like that, right? And they normally help each other. Actually, the worst hit were the sort of middle income people living in the cities. Right? But what we also realized was that unlike Singapore, where most of these people live in high-rise flats, many of them were living very packed together, but still had a small plot of land, maybe 10 square meters or 5 square meters, together with their townhouses, So one of the programs that we initiated with Sri Lanka was the livelihoods for this group. That means how to help initiate some sort of garden, some sort of husbandry in these small urban plots.
Okay.
Because we expect that they will be affected from the financial crisis for at least another 3 to 5 years. So, this will provide for them. So this is one kind of livelihood that we have been supporting. Another example is in Philippines, after a typhoon, we have built a vocational training center.
Okay.
Right, to help reach out to these communities living in a island, a big island, much bigger than Singapore, but small island by Philippine standard, so that these people are not just dependent on the rural farming. They get the technical skills and they can move on from that, and especially the younger generation. So this but over the last 2 or 3 years, just before COVID, we have also pivoted to downstream. So more and more, we are working with communities in Southeast Asia, South Asia, on capacity building, on preparedness. In fact, we initiated a program called the Center of Excellence for Pandemic Preparedness. Not health, not medical preparedness, but community preparedness. How do you recognize that a pandemic is on you? How do you respond? Things like that for community leaders, for rural sector people. And we actually initiated it just before COVID.
Wow. Is that the prediction?
And during COVID, everyone said, wow. And so Southeast Asia, we work closely with Southeast Asia. It was meant for Southeast Asia. But countries in South Asia also, after we helped them during COVID-19, wanted to be part of this initiative. So I think these are some of the things that internationally we are doing. We do what we can, and I think this pivot to preparedness, to training people for capacity, to be for community to be prepared before like disaster strikes. I think these are things that we hope in the end they help the most vulnerable communities. These are not really meant for the elite communities, and we hope that by doing so we can help play a small role in alleviating poverty in the region.
Okay, thank you so much. That's fabulous to know. So I think Red Cross Singapore has done so many great things to help to alleviate the poverty and inequality within Singapore. Like you have mentioned, that you focus on elderly population, you focus on disadvantaged people. Internationally, you help other countries like Philippines, like Sri Lanka to recover in a better way from the crisis that they have experienced. And I'm amazed by what Red Cross Singapore has done and has contributed to addressing the poverty and inequality issues locally and internationally. So I know I have taken a lot of your time, but here it comes to kind of my last two questions, which is more about your personal journey. So I understand that you also held a bachelor degree in economics, and I think students who are watching this video might be curious about the potential career paths that align with addressing poverty and inequality. And I actually look at your LinkedIn, and I found that you have this extensive professional journey across various organizations, including Singapore Foreign Ministry. So before we finish, could you briefly illustrate how your economics education have shaped your career trajectory, and what advice you would give to our students or young individuals who may also consider dedicating their career to making a positive impact in those critical areas?
Thank you. Yeah. So just to share with your students, I actually started off my tertiary journey thinking that I would become an engineer. But after 1 year, so I shifted and I pivoted to political science and economics. I think deep down I was more a political scientist or economist than an engineer, but I've never regretted my decision. So I think for those of you who are studying economics and even political science, but perhaps even more so economics, is that one thing that you learn very quickly is that there are many things that you learn in university which may not seem directly relevant when you go into the real world. But economics and political science are two things where almost everything that you deal with in the real world have some relevance to it. So you must take a broader perspective of it. I think if you call yourself an economist and you just focus on what you learn in university, you are not a true economist. A true economist is always growing because the world changes, how people behave changes, and an economist must be able to understand it in order to understand the real world of today. So I think if you have chosen path is economics, I think it is a very good way of understanding how the world works. But remember that you must constantly grow.
Yeah.
I think economics also provides you a platform to develop a career in many areas. It's one of those disciplines which gives you many options. So I eventually chose a path in foreign service. But at the same time that the foreign service took me in, I was offered positions in 3 of the top banks in Singapore. So you can see that economics can lead you into a banking career, which is very obvious, and it can lead you into a career which is not so obvious. But I think what is interesting is that, and by the way, in foreign ministry, where most of my colleagues were political science graduates, I was one of the few who took my further studies in economics. I became an asset because understanding a lot of understanding the reason why certain countries do what they do or certain leaders do what they do is based more on the economic rationale than the political rationale. Of course, often the political rationale as well, but if you don't understand the economic rationale, you will never fully understand the political rationale. So I think that's very important. But my encouragement to you is that it has been a constant companion throughout my journey, including in the social service sector. So when you come into the social service sector, your understanding of economics, your understanding of being able to understand economic reports and studies and all that is quite critical for you, especially as you plan strategies and broader approaches to social action. So bottom line, I would say is that if you have chosen economics as your discipline to build, I think it is a good one.
Yeah.
I'm biased, of course, but I think what I'm trying to say is that you must open your mind to how economics is applied in day-to-day living.
Okay.
And then you will have a very rich career whichever career you choose. But economics is one of those that gives you many options, opens many doors.
Okay, that's fabulous. I totally agree with you. Yeah, and students see that if you study economics, you can also choosing a researcher as your career as well. Yeah, okay. This is a great conversation, Ben, and I have learned a lot from listening to your presentation today. And I believe, and also I hope students will enjoy today's interview. So again, thank you very much for your time, Ben. I think we will finish up here.
Thank you very much, Xueting.